People in the US military. What's the creepiest, most paranormal thing you have encountered during your service? So I'm currently stationed on an aircraft carrier commissioned in '77. There is never a lack of creepiness on that thing at night. I work security on it at night, and we rotate from nights to days every so often. I remember one night, my buddy was heading up to the flight deck with a rifle from where our armory is, first deck, up to the flight deck, 04 level, which is a 5-story difference. It's a lot of distance to travel alone at night. So he gets to a certain part of the boat that's almost pitch black, 1 story down from the flight deck, and he hears these footsteps behind him. He looks back and no one is there. So he picks up the pace, and as he does, he hears the same footsteps. He looks back and this time, he sees a dark figure about 30 feet behind him. At this point his flip that switch turns on, and he starts briskly jogging. He then hears the footsteps also pick up the pace and run after him. He dead sprints up the last flight of stairs up to the flight deck and hustles over to where we are on the front of the ship. He's white as a ghost and tells us what happens. We stay away from that area of the ship now. I was by myself in the engine room of a submarine on the mid-watch, just a newly reported sailor trying to find equipment so I could display knowledge to one of the watch standers. There are a number of bays in engine room lower level with narrow passages that pass through the center. I came down one of the ladders and I swore I saw someone walk across the ship about 15 feet in front of me. I could hear his footsteps as he walked around a corner and out of sight. 3 problems. 1. He was wearing utilities, an older light blue blouse and dark navy slacks. Nobody had utilities anymore. They had been phased out 3 years earlier. 2. There was only one other person awake in the engine room that late at night, and he was standing at the top of the ladder behind me, waiting for me to come back up with an answer to his question. 3. He wasn't actually there. I wrote it off as sleep deprivation, but I'll admit it shook me for a while. Fast forward to 4 months later, I had gone out to sea with another submarine of the same type. While I was there, I met a sailor who had previously served on my ship. After a few weeks of standing watch with him, he told me a story of a sailor who had committed self-ending while on watch when he served on my ship almost a decade earlier. In engine room lower level. In his utilities. One of my drill sergeants actually has a creepy story from one of his Afghanistan deployments. He was infantry, so being in the field and out of missions for multiple weeks wasn't uncommon. One night while sleeping in a fighting position he felt something nibbling at his feet. He woke up and kicked it off, and what he saw wasn't any type of marsupial, but a little humanoid figure he could only describe as looking just like Gollum. But being in the field with little sleep, he chalked it up to just seeing things. A couple days later, he and another guy was on watch. The other guy pointed out something and said, "What the fleeb is that?" and pointed at a stone wall in the distance. My drill sergeant looked through his binoculars and crawling across the top of this stone wall was the exact little humanoid creature he encountered a few nights before. This is my dad's story. After he was done in Vietnam, he soon stationed at an Air Force base in Greenland. They had bad blizzards often there, and when they came through, the base shut down and every section of the barracks would take roll call. These blizzards are intense. There were cables running between all the buildings that you attached to your person with a carabiner, so if there was a sudden whiteout, you didn't get lost and die. They had people die literally 20 meters from shelter because they got lost in bad weather and froze. He said for about 5 months, every time they locked down for weather, they would hear horrendous screaming outside. Everyone was accounted for so they didn't risk sending anyone out to investigate. They wrote it off as an animal. However, every time this was heard, the engine room would be wrecked. Tools everywhere, paperwork all over the floor, tables and toolboxes knocked over. Even one time a several thousand-pound jet engine had been lifted from its workbench crane thing and smashed almost 30 feet away. The hangars and engine room had cameras covering every single possible entrance with spotlights that made them clear even in a whiteout. No animals, no people, no anything was ever seen entering or leaving those buildings. Then one day it just stopped. As a Marine, I used to have the graveyard patrol shift at the Beirut bombing memorial. Part of the memorial is dedicated to a veterans cemetery. Oddly enough, I never got freaked out being completely alone in a remote cemetery in the middle of the night, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. It was actually kind of peaceful, to be honest. However, one night I was patrolling near the perimeter fence where some of the oldest headstones are when I heard the sound of a woman humming. I followed the sound and noticed a light glowing through the vines and brush of a large tree. As I approached, I could literally feel my hair beginning to lift as if there was an electric current in the air. I pushed aside the brush and what I saw nearly took my breath away. It was an old, weathered headstone with a large cross etched into the marble. Only the cross was glowing a bright, vivid blue, like a neon blue. The humming was also suddenly much louder and had a weird plurality to it, like it was coming from hundreds of voices at once. Needless to say, I freaked the flea out. I screamed like a scared little girl and sprinted back to the parking lot. I radioed the guard who was supposed to relieve me and forced him to come early, then spent the rest of my shift in the cab of his truck. I don't think he believed me, but he stayed in his truck and didn't go out on patrol until the sun was fully up. A few days later, I worked up the nerve to return to the grave during the day, of course. As I suspected, in the light of day it was a completely mundane headstone. There was no name, only the aforementioned cross. I ran my hands over the stone and checked to see if maybe there was some sort of hidden light source or solar panel, but no, it was just plain, solid, unremarkable stone. The humming was gone too. I eventually returned to my normal shift, but never again experienced anything out of the ordinary. I never learned whose grave that was either, but I find myself thinking about it from time to time. It certainly sounds absurd when I say it out loud, and I suppose it could have been a hallucination or a trick of my tired brain, but I don't believe it was. I think it was real, a ghost or spirit of some sort, but I don't think it was malevolent at all. I was working the night shift in an old SIF that was originally built back in the 50s. I was starting to feel sleepy, so I went for a walk to wake myself up and ended up getting lost in the maze of underground tunnels, finding myself in a part of the complex that obviously hadn't been used in decades. Everything looked like it was just left there and forgotten one day, eerily frozen in time. I was extremely tired and stressed out from work, and that really didn't help me to be able to rationally retrace my steps. Everything around me seemed like something was hiding in the shadows and watching me. It took a long time, but I finally made it back to my position and didn't tell anyone what happened. Luckily, it was the night shift and no one noticed I was gone. A year later, we got a new guy in the middle of the night shift. He got up and went for a walk. A couple of hours later he came back looking like he'd seen a ghost. I just gave him a knowing nod and he knew I knew exactly what he just went through. Navy. When I was in Groton CT for basic enlisted submarine school, I was roving the barracks at night. I had a UI under instruction, so I was showing him the ropes. What to check and how to check. It was mainly fire extinguishers and secured doors. Well, on the second or third floor of the barracks, there is a recreation room with a TV and chairs and a piano. Mind you, everyone was asleep and it was 0200 in the morning. Well, I decided to go and see if I remembered how to play the piano a little. We decided to continue to finish the patrol, so we started walking down the hall when we heard a single piano note go off. We both heard it while I was in mid-conversation, so we kind of looked back, and then we both looked at each other to see if we both had heard the same noise. We shrugged it off as our imaginations running wild. But as soon as we got to the end of the hall and opened the door to the stairway, a sharp key note was heard coming from down the hall in the direction of the room with the piano. We left the floor as soon as possible and later shared the story with some shipmates, and they told us stories of sailors that had died in the barracks. Back in 2012, I was lucky enough to be a private in the army in Afghanistan. I won't bore you with details, but I meddled with the radios on a small team in a pretty remote area on a combat outpost. We conducted 24-hour operations and one night, we get this very weird transmission. It came in pretty strong, and we couldn't determine from what direction it was coming in. However, what truly made it odd was what was being said. Now, I'm no linguist, but I know enough about different languages to know this wasn't Pashtun or Dari, or even English for that matter, it was straight up Russian. This is when red flags start going up and we begin to make phone calls to our operations center and begin to wake people up. We had a recording device and managed to catch most of the broadcast before it stopped completely. We didn't have any Russian linguists with us. We had no idea what was going on. We sent a copy of the recording over Highside to get information translated. I knew one of the warrant officers in my unit was also a Russian linguist back from the Cold War era and had him have a listen as well. He was rusty but got the general gist of the message. It was a distress call asking for help, that their base was being overrun and being attacked. This was even more confusing as there hasn't been a Russian base in AF since their occupation. We schemed a lot over what caused it. He said maybe it was a pre-recorded beacon that may have just randomly gone off after all these years, who knows. The only thing that bothered me with that explanation was that the whole thing didn't sound like a pre-recorded audio. There was an obvious level of distress in their voice. Albeit, there was no background noise to it. I worked in Arlington National Cemetery while I was in the army. The tomb guards always talked about seeing or just hearing soldiers marching some nights. We were cataloging graves one night when I thought I saw a soldier in my team up ahead, so I called him over. He answered from behind me. When I looked back, the other soldier was gone. I am a skeptic, and I believe everything paranormal has a real-world explanation, but I'm still trying to figure that one out. I was a corpsman stationed in Okinawa between 2014 to 2016. There are a lot of stories about Oki being haunted as heck. I heard a lot of Marines tell me about episodes of sleep paralysis where they'd wake up at night unable to move, with dark figures standing over them, or more often women. Camp Hansen was particularly haunted, or so they say. I worked ambulance services there, and there was a particular barracks building, I can't remember the number, that received quite a few calls while I was there. Possession-type incidents, where Marines would suddenly become extremely violent and begin screaming about demons, to the point where it would take about 10 people to hold them down. I personally responded to one such incident. A Marine was just drinking beer down by the quarterdeck, a well-known Marine with no prior history of mental illness or incidents, a pretty straight shooter, suddenly became delirious at the drop of a hat. He went from chatting normally to smashing his face against the stairs, screaming, "Make it stop." I arrived on scene and he was being held down by at least 8 or 9 people. He was thrashing wildly and contorting like something out of the Fleabag Exorcist, trying to smash his head back against the floor. All the while repeating, "Make it stop." I did my job and got him to the I can't say for certain whether it was supernatural, as there was a big Calaxian problem at the time as well, spice, cough syrup, stuff you find in Japan, and I do believe he tested positive for rhabdomyolysis, which can cause confusion. But this was really acute. Like at the drop of a hat, not gradual in the slightest.